When Thor, the German shepherd, broke the silence of the funeral with his desperate barks, no one could have predicted the disturbing secret that was about to be revealed. Surprised eyes turned to the dog as he circled the coffin with an unsettling urgency, as if trying to warn of something only he could sense. In a final act of courage, the cemetery fell silent as the coffin lid was opened. What they found inside sent everyone into a spiral of mystery and fear, and a simple farewell ceremony became the beginning of an investigation that would shake the entire town. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any exciting stories like this one. Here, each video is a journey of overcoming an emotion that you won't want to miss. The gentle rain fell incessantly on the day of Mark Silva's funeral, draping the scene in a somber, misty veil. Under the overcast sky, family and friends gathered in silence, their expressions marked by sorrow and quiet grief. Mark's mother, Lara, stood near the closed casket, her eyes red-rimmed and vacant, holding back tears. Her pain was mirrored in those around her, each person lost in memories of the man they had come to mourn. The air felt thick, almost stifling, as if the sky itself was mourning alongside them. The funeral director maintained a quiet, respectful stance by the door, allowing the family to grieve in their own way. There were no words needed, the heavy silence spoke for everyone. The flowers on the casket were carefully arranged, their colors subdued, reflecting the solemnity of the occasion. It was the kind of funeral where even the usual comforting words felt inadequate, as if mere phrases could never convey the weight of the loss. Standing a few steps away, an unusual attendee remained vigilant, Thor, Mark's loyal German shepherd. Known for his calm demeanor and steadfast loyalty, Thor had been Mark's shadow through all of life's phases. On this day, he sat motionless, his body still and posture erect, as if paying his own quiet respects. But anyone watching closely might have noticed something peculiar in his behavior. His gaze never left the casket. Initially, Thor seemed to be just another mourner, lost in his own canine way of grieving. Yet, unlike the humans around him, Thor's grief didn't manifest in tears or silence. Instead, it revealed itself in something almost intangible, a barely perceptible shift in his stance. It was as though he sensed something no one else could, something hidden beyond the closed lid of the casket. A few of Mark's close friends noticed the dog's behavior, exchanging puzzled glances. They were familiar with Thor's calm temperament, a trait that had served Mark well over the years, especially in times of stress. But today, Thor's demeanor was different. His ears perked up slightly, and he adjusted his position, his body tensing with an alertness that seemed out of place for a simple farewell. After a few minutes, Thor rose to his feet, moving slowly but deliberately towards the casket. His nose lowered as he sniffed the air in careful, measured movements. Circling the casket with an intent focus, Thor's actions seemed less like those of a mourning pet and more like those of a guard dog on duty. The guests watched with a mix of curiosity and apprehension, unsure whether to ignore his behavior or to consider it as something more. Aunt Clara, standing with her hand on her chest, couldn't help but feel a shiver of unease. She whispered to those nearby, "Animals can sense things we can't." Her words were met with nods of agreement from those who had also taken notice. Clara's comment struck a chord, the kind of superstitious observation that felt oddly fitting given the gravity of the day. The air seemed to grow colder, as if the room itself were responding to the dog's strange actions. As Thor continued to circle the casket, a low whine escaped from his throat, followed by a quiet but unmistakable growl. The sound was soft but carried through the room, drawing the attention of everyone present. The mourners shifted uncomfortably, exchanging anxious looks as the dog's behavior grew more peculiar. Whispers filled the room, and the once muted atmosphere shifted, as if Thor's instincts were slowly unsettling the entire gathering. Without warning, Thor let out a loud, commanding bark. The suddenness of the sound cut through the quiet like a knife, startling those nearby. Thor barked again, louder this time, his eyes fixed intently on the casket, his body tense and unmoving. People instinctively stepped back, feeling an almost primal fear rise within them. They could sense that this was no ordinary bark, no simple outburst. Thor was warning them, though of what, they could not say. The silence that followed was heavy with apprehension, and the room fell still as everyone turned their gaze toward the dog. Thor's barking continued, each one sharper, filled with a desperation that was both unsettling and impossible to ignore. Some guests tried to dismiss it as a reaction to grief, but there was something undeniably eerie in the dog's urgency. As Thor's barks echoed through the room, it was clear he was trying to communicate a truth no one else could see. The air inside the room was tense as Thor's barks reverberated, leaving everyone stunned. Some whispered nervously, while others exchanged anxious glances, trying to interpret what the dog's behavior could mean. Aunt Clara, still watching with an uneasy expression, whispered, "Animals can sense things we can't." Her comment lingered in the minds of those nearby, heightening the unease that had already settled over the room. Thor's intense gaze remained fixed on the casket, his body rigid, and his barks continued with an urgency that was impossible to ignore. Mark's mother, Lara, approached the dog cautiously, reaching out her hand as if to soothe him. Her own heart was pounding. She had never seen Thor behave this way before. "Thor, calm down," she whispered, her voice trembling. But Thor pulled away from her touch, his eyes never leaving the wooden surface of the casket. His reaction startled her, and she stepped back, realizing that nothing would distract him from whatever was capturing his attention. Some of the mourners suggested that Thor's behavior might be the result of grief or confusion, perhaps from the crowd or the somber setting. However, others could sense that it was more than that. Thor's agitation grew with each passing moment. He began pacing back and forth near the casket, sniffing the air as if he were picking up a scent that only he could detect. His low whines shifted into a growl, and every time someone tried to calm him, he responded with a sharp bark that filled the room with even more tension. Watching Thor's increasingly frantic behavior, a neighbor named Henry spoke up, suggesting, "Maybe we should call a trainer or someone who knows police dogs, he's trying to tell us something." Murmurs of agreement followed, and a few nodded as they exchanged uneasy glances. Henry's words seemed to confirm a growing sense of dread, as if something unknown and dangerous was hovering just beyond their reach. The dog's behavior felt like a warning, one that no one dared to ignore. Without delay, a call was placed, and soon Jorge, a retired police officer who trained service dogs, arrived. He entered the room cautiously, observing Thor's behavior with a professional eye. He had seen dogs display strange reactions before, especially in stressful situations, but Thor's actions felt intentional, calculated. Jorge approached Thor slowly, careful not to disrupt whatever the dog was focusing on. He crouched beside him, studying the tension in Thor's posture and the unwavering direction of his gaze. As Jorge observed the dog, he began to feel the weight of Thor's focus. Thor's attention wasn't random, it was deliberate, pointed. After several moments of quiet observation, Jorge turned to the crowd and spoke with a grave expression, "He's not just barking out of grief. This dog is trying to show us something." His words sent a ripple through the crowd, casting a deep, unsettling silence. Everyone's eyes moved back to the casket, their breaths held in collective anticipation. Lara, Mark's mother, gripped her hands together as her nerves took over. She had hoped the dog would calm down, that this strange episode would pass, but Jorge's words made her realize it was more than that. The feeling in the room shifted once again, from simple curiosity to a profound, creeping fear. Jorge, sensing the tension in everyone, added, "I've seen dogs alert to things that don't make sense to us. But they sense truth, even if we don't understand it yet." By now, all eyes were on the casket. Jorge approached it cautiously, placing a steadying hand on its surface as if to brace himself for what they might uncover. Thor's barking subsided momentarily, replaced by an intense stare as if the dog was willing Jorge to understand. Jorge took a deep breath, then looked to the family. His voice was calm but serious, "Maybe we should open it, sometimes dogs know things we don't." The suggestion fell like a weight on everyone's minds, filling the room with a suffocating sense of dread. Lara exchanged glances with her family, each of them visibly shaken. Finally, with a heavy nod, she gave Jorge permission. As he prepared to open the casket, Thor sat beside it, his stance quiet but still alert, as if his warning had finally been understood. With a deep breath, Jorge placed his hands on the casket, his fingers hesitating over the lid. The room was utterly silent, the air thick with anticipation and fear. Everyone gathered around the casket, forming a tense semicircle. Some watched with wide, apprehensive eyes, while others stood back, unsure if they wanted to witness whatever was about to be revealed. Thor had stopped barking and was now sitting beside the casket, his eyes fixed on it, a strange calm having overtaken him, as if he knew his message had been heard. Jorge glanced back at Lara, who nodded slightly, her face pale and her hands trembling. Lara's mind was swirling with confusion and dread. She trusted Thor's instincts. Mark had always said that Thor was more than just a pet, he was family, a protector. The decision to open the casket felt monumental, like it would shatter the fragile reality they'd been clinging to. And yet, they needed to know. They owed it to Mark's memory. Slowly, Jorge began to lift the lid, the creak of the hinges breaking the silence. Time seemed to slow down, each second stretching painfully as the lid rose, revealing the face of the man inside. Gasps filled the room as the gathered crowd looked inside, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock. For a moment, no one moved, as if frozen in disbelief. What they saw wasn't just surprising, it was deeply unsettling. The face inside the casket did not belong to Mark Silva. Murmurs erupted, questions mingling with cries of shock and confusion. Lara stumbled back, her hands covering her mouth as she struggled to understand what she was seeing. She had come here to say goodbye to her son, but the man in the casket was a stranger. Her knees buckled, and a relative had to help steady her. It was a surreal, horrifying moment, one that twisted the solemn atmosphere of mourning into something nightmarish. Who is this?" Lara managed to whisper, her voice barely audible over the rising commotion. People around her shook their heads in disbelief, their eyes fixed on the face of the stranger lying where Mark should have been. The realization hit everyone at once, there had been a terrible, inexplicable mistake. This was no longer a mere funeral, this was now a mystery, one that filled everyone with a chilling sense of dread. Jorge, equally shocked, turned back to the family, his face grim. "I don't know how this could happen," he said, his voice low. "But this man, this isn't Mark." The weight of his words hung heavily in the air, sending a fresh wave of whispers and gasps through the room. People looked around, as if seeking answers from each other, yet all they found were mirrored expressions of horror and disbelief. Thor, still sitting beside the casket, looked up at Lara with a steady, knowing gaze. In that moment it was as if the dog understood the full gravity of what had just been discovered. His once frantic behavior had subsided, replaced by a strange calmness that seemed almost eerie. It was as though Thor had known the truth all along and had been waiting for them to uncover it for themselves. One by one, the guests began to back away from the casket, uncomfortable with the sight of the stranger lying within it. Some covered their mouths, others whispered in disbelief, and some simply looked away, unwilling to confront the shocking reality before them. The family clung to each other, their minds racing with unanswered questions. How had such a mistake been made? Where was Mark? As the initial shock subsided, the urgency to find answers intensified. The police were called, and soon, officers arrived at the scene, their expressions hardening as they took in the strange situation. They would need to investigate the identity of the man in the casket, as well as locate Mark, who now seemed to be missing. Thor remained by the casket, his silent presence a reminder of the strange sequence of events that had led them to this discovery. As the police secured the scene and began their investigation, the once quiet funeral erupted into a murmur of whispers and questions. Lara felt faint, barely able to comprehend the scene before her. Neighbors, friends, and family members huddled in clusters, their faces a mix of horror, confusion, and disbelief. The usual grief that hangs over a funeral had shifted into something else entirely, a haunting, uneasy doubt that lingered in every glance, every hushed conversation. Standing with her sister and a few close friends, Lara tried to make sense of it all. How could this happen? She asked, her voice trembling. Her sister, Sophia, squeezed her hand, though she had no answers to offer. The hospital had called her days ago, confirming that it was Mark who had passed, and she had gone through every necessary step, making arrangements with a heavy heart. And now, here she was, with a stranger in her son's place. Officer Mendez, the lead investigator on the scene, approached Lara and her family, his expression serious. "We're going to conduct a full investigation, Mrs. Silva. I assure you, we'll get to the bottom of this," he said, his voice filled with professional calm, though a hint of unease lingered in his eyes. He too was struggling to understand how such an error could happen. The body in the casket was a mystery, and finding Mark was now their top priority. Thor, who had grown calm after the casket was opened, sat silently beside Lara, his eyes still fixed on the casket. It was as if he understood that something was amiss, that his job of alerting the humans had only just begun. Lara knelt beside him, running her hand over his fur as if drawing comfort from his steady presence. She didn't understand why, but she felt as though Thor knew more than anyone else in that room. A few yards away, the murmurs among the guests grew louder, with theories circulating through the small groups. Some speculated that the mix-up might have been caused by an administrative error at the hospital. Others whispered darker theories, wondering if something more sinister was at play. The room was thick with tension, and the usual condolences and quiet conversations of a funeral were now replaced with hushed voices of suspicion and fear. As officers began questioning those closest to Mark, Lara was asked to recount her last moments with her son. "It was a few weeks ago," she said, her voice shaking. "Mark went out on duty one night, and I was told he was injured in a robbery. But after that, the hospital handled everything. They called me, told me he was gone." The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and Officer Mendez took careful notes, his brow furrowed as he tried to piece together the sequence of events. The more the family recounted, the more puzzling the situation became. Officer Mendez exchanged glances with his colleagues, realizing that the body's identity was now just as mysterious as Mark's whereabouts. The reality that someone else's body had been lying in Mark's casket, awaiting a burial, was too strange, too horrible to comprehend. How many people were involved in this mix-up? And where was Mark? In the midst of the confusion, a retired police officer, Jorge, who had initially observed Thor's behavior, approached Officer Mendez. "Thor knew something was wrong," he said, nodding toward the German Shepherd. "I've seen dogs alert to things beyond our understanding, but this is different. He sensed the truth before any of us did." Officer Mendez nodded thoughtfully, looking at Thor with new respect. The dog's instincts had led them to a revelation they might have otherwise missed. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, the gravity of the mystery grew. The guests, shaken and uncertain, slowly began to disperse. The family, however, lingered, unwilling to leave without answers. With heavy hearts, they knew that today's discovery was only the beginning. Somewhere out there, Mark was missing, and the hope of finding him became the only light in a day steeped in darkness and doubt. As the investigation deepened, details from that fateful night began to resurface, painting a picture of chaos and danger. Mark had been on duty with a close colleague, Adam, who was a seasoned officer and a friend since their academy days. That night, they'd received an urgent call about a robbery at a local bank. Adam and Mark, alongside Mark's loyal companion Thor, had raced toward the scene, sirens wailing as they sped through the dark streets. Upon arrival, they found the suspects heavily armed and unyielding, barricading themselves in a nearby alley. As Mark and Adam advanced, Thor remained alert in the patrol car, watching as his handler faced off with the criminals. The night was dark, but the urgency of the situation filled Mark and Adam with a sense of duty, forcing them forward despite the danger. The firefight was intense. Shots echoed through the streets, reverberating off buildings as the two officers bravely confronted the armed thieves. At one point, seeing that Mark was directly in the line of fire, Adam threw himself in front of his friend, taking a shot that would have been fatal for Mark. It was an act of selfless bravery, a decision made in a fraction of a second, but one that would change everything. Thor barked frantically, sensing his handler was in mortal danger. He managed to break out of the car, sprinting toward the chaos, as if he could somehow protect his friend. By the time the backup arrived, both Mark and Adam were on the ground, and Thor was by Mark's side, nudging him with his nose, his whines growing softer as paramedics rushed in. Adam's injuries were fatal. He was pronounced dead at the scene, while Mark, critically wounded, was rushed to the hospital in a race against time. The emergency room was chaotic, doctors and nurses scrambled to save him. In the confusion, Mark's identity was somehow switched with Adam's, leading to the mistaken notification of his death. No one knew that the man identified as Mark was, in fact, Adam. The truth would lie buried in confusion and miscommunication. Meanwhile, Thor had been left behind at the hospital, unwilling to leave his handler. When hospital staff tried to take him away, he growled, refusing to move from his vigil at the door, his instincts fighting against the mistake that no one had yet uncovered. His presence was an unnoticed warning, an attempt to prevent a tragic misunderstanding. As days turned into weeks, Adam's family prepared for a funeral, mourning the loss of a husband, son, and friend. Mark, meanwhile, remained in a coma, unidentified, with no family aware of his true fate. His absence went unnoticed, his identity buried beneath clerical errors and hurried assumptions. And all the while, Thor's loyalty never wavered, he continued to watch, waiting for the truth to come to light. This tragic mix-up, brought on by chaos and oversight, would come to haunt the families of both men. While Adam's family mourned the loss of their son, Mark's family was unknowingly separated from him. The hospital's silence and procedural failures would lead them all into a devastating confrontation with the truth. With the recent discovery of the wrong body in Mark's casket, the focus turned to the hospital, where the tragic error had first occurred. Officer Mendez returned to the hospital to question staff about that night. The director of the hospital, Dr. Cardoso, a man with years of experience, was as shocked as anyone. "This isn't just a mistake," he told Mendez solemnly. "This is a catastrophic error." As Dr. Cardoso reviewed hospital records, it became clear that Mark and Adam's identities had been mistakenly switched in the rush of that chaotic night. Their personal belongings, removed during the surgery, had been misidentified, and when Adam was pronounced dead, the mistake became solidified in hospital records. Mendez took notes, his face grim as he realized the depth of the mistake. The doctor summoned the nurses and surgeons on duty that night, demanding an explanation. The emergency room had been overwhelmed, they explained, with multiple trauma cases. The doctors had operated on Mark without checking identities, assuming the belongings and ID tags matched. One of the nurses admitted, through tears, that she'd tried to confirm identities but had been overruled due to the urgency. Meanwhile, Thor had been brought into the hospital's waiting area, refusing to leave Mark's side. He'd whined and barked, sensing that something was wrong, but no one had understood his behavior as anything more than grief. Now, with this new information, Mendez understood that Thor had been trying to alert everyone to the mistake. The loyal dog had known, somehow, that his friend was still there, fighting for his life. The hospital staff could barely look at each other as they realized the extent of their oversight. Mendez asked for a full report and called the family members to explain the tragic mistake. Both Adam's and Mark's families would have to be informed, and it would take all the police department's efforts to ensure the correction was handled with care. The waiting room became a scene of heartbreak as Mendez explained everything to the two families. Lara clutched her chest, the revelation a mix of pain and relief. Adam's parents were silent, devastated by the knowledge that their son had been buried under the wrong name. They, too, had lost a beloved family member but now were left with a shattered sense of closure. Despite the sadness, there was a glimmer of hope for Mark's family. He was still alive, though still comatose. With tears in her eyes, Lara whispered, "Bring me to my son." She turned to Thor, kneeling down to embrace him. "Thank you," she murmured, as Thor sat, calm and faithful, as if to reassure her that he had fulfilled his purpose. For the first time since the accident, Lara stood by her son's hospital bed, her hand resting gently on his. Mark's face was pale, his breathing assisted by machines, but he was there, alive. Thor sat by her side, his head resting on the bed, his loyal presence a comfort in the sterile hospital room. Seeing her son again, she felt both sorrow for Adam's family and gratitude for Thor's intervention. Dr. Cardoso entered the room, somber as he explained Mark's condition. "He's stable but still in a coma," he said softly. "We'll need time to see if he'll recover." The family listened, their hearts weighed by the months of confusion and sorrow that had led to this moment. Yet there was a renewed hope that, despite the mistakes, Mark might still come back to them. Meanwhile, Mendez and his team conducted an internal investigation into the protocols that had led to such a catastrophic mistake. The hospital director vowed to ensure stricter identification procedures, but for Lara, nothing could erase the heartbreak and pain of the mix-up. Her only focus was on Mark's recovery, willing him silently to wake up and return to the family that had missed him so dearly. Adam's family also faced the reality of their loss, a mix of grief and anger as they processed the truth. The police department and hospital staff had apologized, but the pain remained. They visited the cemetery to replace the tombstone with Adam's real name, honoring him with a proper farewell. Though the process was painful, they found solace in knowing he had been a hero to the very end. For weeks, Lara stayed by Mark's side, holding his hand, talking to him, and updating him on everything he'd missed. She thanked Thor repeatedly, feeling that the dog's instincts had been the very thing that saved her son from a burial under the wrong name. Thor's presence became a constant, his loyalty a reminder of Mark's second chance at life. As time passed, Mark's fingers began to twitch, a small but promising sign of recovery. Lara watched with bated breath, holding his hand, her heart pounding as the doctors monitored his responses. Finally, one evening, his eyes opened, weak and unfocused but alive. Lara wept as Mark's gaze slowly found hers, a look of recognition and love filling the room. With Mark's miraculous recovery, the community rallied to support him and his family. News of the mix-up had spread, sparking both outrage and support. Local officials vowed to investigate and revise hospital policies, ensuring stricter protocols would prevent future mistakes. Mark became a symbol of resilience, and his family found new meaning in the journey they had endured. Mark, slowly regaining his strength, dedicated his recovery to honoring Adam's sacrifice. He spoke to his colleagues, sharing memories of Adam's bravery and recounting the night's events. Thor became a hero in his own right, recognized for his loyalty and instincts that had saved his handler from an unthinkable mistake. The town honored both men with a plaque commemorating their service. Months later, as Mark returned to work, he attended a special ceremony in Adam's memory. He stood before the crowd, paying tribute to his friend and recalling the sacrifice that had saved his life. The words he spoke resonated deeply with the community, a heartfelt reminder of the bond shared by those in service. Mark's recovery became a beacon of hope for the town, a symbol of resilience and the power of friendship. Thor was honored as a true hero, a reminder of the unique bond between a handler and his dog. The community gathered for a memorial honoring Adam's sacrifice and Mark's journey, their story leaving an indelible mark on everyone who heard it. Both families continued to share the story, advocating for change and inspiring others with their message of resilience. Hospital policies were revised, police procedures improved, and families in mourning found comfort in the community's new sense of vigilance and care. Mark eventually made a full recovery, returning to work with Thor by his side, ready to serve with a renewed purpose. Adam's memory remained alive in Mark's heart, a testament to courage and sacrifice. The town recognized the value of loyalty, honor, and resilience, a legacy that would guide them for generations. Mark and Thor moved forward, forever bonded by the journey they had endured and the lives they had touched, carrying the memory of friendship and loyalty, honoring those who serve and protect. If you liked this story and want more content like this, leave a like, share it with someone you know will be moved by it, and of course, subscribe to the channel. Together, we will explore inspiring stories and moments that touch the heart. Until the next video.